I spent so much time worrying would it ruin our marriage to get in the White House. Jacqueline Kennedy recorded those words in 1964, sitting across from historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. on tapes that stayed sealed for nearly half a century. She worried about what power would cost, but the marriage, its survival, its public presentation, its continuation through scandal after scandal, had never been hers to control. That authority belonged to her father-in-law, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., the patriarch who built a fortune across 4 industries, purchased a presidential election, reportedly offered his own daughter-in-law a substantial sum to stay through the election, and engineered every element of the Kennedy myth, except its most enduring chapter. Jackie wrote that one herself. She wrote it so well it swallowed everything he'd built. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. built a fortune across Wall Street, Hollywood, liquor distribution, and real estate. He wielded that fortune like a political instrument, cultivating a web of relationships with the people who determined what Americans saw, read, and believed. Beautiful photographs of JFK and Jackie adorned the pages of magazines like Life throughout the late 1950s and into the White House years. Scholars who have studied the Kennedy public image specifically credit both Joseph and Jackie Kennedy for constructing the dazzling brand that surrounded JFK's political rise. That saturated, flattering media coverage wasn't organic. Every frame of it was cultivated by a man who understood that in American politics, narrative is the product and perception is the only currency that matters. Joe Sr. had always aimed his family at the presidency. When that ambition focused on John, the patriarch applied the same operational discipline he brought to every enterprise, identifying assets, neutralizing liabilities, purchasing whatever merit alone couldn't deliver. The 1960 presidential campaign in particular bore Joe Kennedy's fingerprints everywhere. JFK acknowledged the family's approach to electoral politics at the 1958 Gridiron Dinner, with a joke that drew knowing laughter from a room full of Washington insiders. "I just received the following wire from my generous daddy. Dear Jack, don't buy a single vote more than is necessary. I'll be damned if I'm going to pay for a landslide." Everyone laughed. Nobody thought it was fiction. The 1960 presidential race was Joe Kennedy Sr.'s crowning operation. In the West Virginia primary, Kennedy money flowed in quantities sufficient to shift outcomes that conventional campaigning couldn't explain. The general election against Richard Nixon produced a margin so razor-thin that the methods used to secure it would shadow the Kennedy legacy for decades. In Illinois, allegations of mob-connected vote manipulation in Chicago persisted for decades. His son entered the White House. The patriarch had delivered. But purchasing a presidency required more than money and mobilized precincts. It required a brand that could survive scrutiny. And the single most valuable element of the Kennedy brand was a woman Joe Sr. hadn't raised, hadn't selected for the role he needed filled, and would never manage the way he managed everything else. Jacqueline Lee Bouvier arrived carrying assets the Kennedy family needed and couldn't generate from within. Her father, John Vernou Blackjack Bouvier III, was a stockbroker with devastating good looks and a gift for self-destruction. Heavy drinking, compulsive womanizing so conspicuous that even the permissive social circles of 1930s East Hampton took notice. Her mother, Janet Lee Bouvier, eventually left him for Hugh D. Auchincloss, whose far larger fortune and far less charisma pulled Jackie into the orbit of genuine old money. Auchincloss wealth, though, occupied a different category from Kennedy wealth. The Bouviers had social grace. The Kennedys had an apparatus. Jackie bridged the gap in ways no amount of campaign spending could replicate. She'd attended Vassar, studied at the Sorbonne in Paris, graduated from George Washington University, and then taken a job as the Inquiring Camera Girl at the Washington Times-Herald, a position that immersed her in the daily mechanics of storytelling. Man-on-the-street interviews, questions calibrated to open subjects up or shut them down. A developing instinct for framing, angle, and the distance between what people say and what they mean. Joe Kennedy Sr. looked at this young socialite who spoke fluent French, Italian, and Spanish, who moved through diplomatic settings with European ease, and he saw a photogenic accessory for his son's political brand. A visual argument for the sophistication their Irish Catholic machine lacked. What the patriarch failed to recognize, and would never recognize, was that the woman he was recruiting already understood how images got constructed and stories got told. She understood it as a professional skill, honed at a newspaper desk, and that skill would eventually make her more dangerous to his control over the Kennedy narrative than any political rival or investigative reporter. Their marriage functioned, from Joe Sr.'s perspective, as a portfolio acquisition. Jackie's presence on magazine covers, at campaign dinners, beside JFK at official events, elevated the family brand from political operation to American aristocracy. The patriarch deployed her for maximum visibility and expected compliance. Her preferences, her desire for privacy, her interior life ranked well below polling data on his operational priorities. The most revealing evidence of Joe Kennedy Sr.'s transactional relationship with his daughter-in-law surfaced, depending on which biographer you trust, in the late 1950s. According to Edward Klein and C. David Heyman, Jackie reportedly came close to leaving the marriage before the 1960 campaign. Joe Sr., unwilling to let a divorce derail his son's presidential ambitions, reportedly offered her a substantial financial inducement, often cited as $1 million, to stay through the election and a potential second term. This claim has never been independently confirmed. It should be understood as a reported allegation, not established fact. But the logic aligns seamlessly with the patriarch's operating philosophy. A problem had materialized. He addressed it the way he addressed every problem in his life. He wrote a check. If even partially true, the arrangement transforms the Kennedy marriage from love story to contract, and makes what Jackie eventually did with the Kennedy narrative exponentially more extraordinary, because the woman who may have been financially retained to play the loyal wife ended up seizing control of the entire production. Why did she stay? The answer has layers Joe Sr. never had to think through, because from his vantage point, the question was already solved. He'd purchased the answer. The children anchored her. Caroline, born in 1957, and John Jr., born weeks after the 1960 election. Catholic prohibition against divorce constrained both families. Leaving a sitting president would annihilate Jackie's social standing along with the Kennedy presidency. Every wall of the cage reinforced the others. From the patriarch's perspective, the structure was elegant, complete, and permanent. What he couldn't measure, what no one in the Kennedy operation thought to calculate, was that Jackie was converting captivity into leverage. Each public humiliation she absorbed with flawless composure deposited political capital into an account only she could access. Each radiant photograph beside a husband the press corps knew was cheating reinforced a moral authority so total that when her moment arrived, no one on earth could challenge her right to define the story. She stayed, because staying accumulated power the patriarch's fortune couldn't buy. Joe Sr.'s investment, meanwhile, paid dividends he could track. Jackie's restoration of the White House carried an ambition that went far beyond decor. "We must make this building something that they will be proud of," she told groups of workers and historians. "I want to make the White House the first house in the land." On February 14, 1962, CBS aired a televised tour she hosted, and 56 million Americans watched. Insiders credited Jackie as 90% of the broadcast's success. The program knocked all the stuffiness out of diplomacy, while projecting an entirely new image of the American presidency. 56 million viewers absorbed a vision of the country as cultured, confident, and beautiful, narrated by a 31-year-old woman the patriarch thought of as a campaign accessory. Abroad, her impact exceeded anything Joe Sr.'s money had achieved. At the Paris summit in May 1961, Charles de Gaulle was so thoroughly charmed by Jackie's fluent French that JFK acknowledged the dynamic with a quip that became one of the most quoted lines of his presidency. "I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris." Nobel laureates attended state dinners she choreographed. Pablo Casals performed in the East Room at her invitation. Joe Kennedy Sr. understood the blunt mechanics of media ownership and campaign finance. Jackie operated at a frequency he couldn't hear. Aesthetics as political argument, taste as ideology, visual culture as the medium through which Americans would ultimately judge and remember a presidency. Every Oleg Cassini dress, every carefully staged photograph on the Hyannisport lawn was a brick in a structure she assembled while the patriarch watched and mistakenly believed it was his. And while Jackie built that public image, the apparatus Joe Kennedy Sr. had constructed sheltered his son's compulsive infidelity. JFK's affairs operated under the protection of a Secret Service detail that looked away and a press corps that observed early 1960s conventions against reporting presidential private life. Biographers Robert Dallek in An Unfinished Life and Seymour Hersh in The Dark Side of Camelot reconstructed a pattern dwarfing ordinary indiscretion. Marilyn Monroe, Judith Campbell Exner, simultaneously involved with Giancana, Mimi Alford, a 19-year-old White House intern who published a memoir decades later. Mary Pinchot Meyer, Jean Tierney, Marlena Dietrich, Angie Dickinson, Blaze Starr. Two young White House secretaries the Secret Service nicknamed Fiddle and Faddle. Roughly 200 liaisons is the number biographers most frequently cite. Precision at that scale becomes irrelevant. The pattern tells the story. Jackie found what connection she could outside the cage. Biographers have documented reported relationships with the actor William Holden and the Italian industrialist Gianni Agnelli. These were the choices of a woman given every reason to seek warmth on her own terms, evidence of survival instinct, of human complexity, of a private self that could sustain the demands of a public performance so flawless most Americans mistook it for her actual personality. The Marilyn Monroe confrontation exposed the distance between Joe Kennedy Sr.'s understanding of power and Jackie's. On May 19, 1962, at a Democratic fundraiser in Madison Square Garden celebrating JFK's upcoming 45th birthday, Monroe walked on stage, sewn into a flesh-colored, rhinestone-encrusted Jean-Louis gown, and delivered that breathy, eroticized, "Happy birthday, Mr. President," that transformed political spectacle into public seduction. JFK grinned from the front row. 15,000 guests cheered and squirmed. Jackie had chosen to spend the weekend in Virginia at a horse show with her children, a surgical absence, a refusal to dignify the performance with her presence. Marilyn reportedly believed JFK might leave his wife for her, that she might become the next First Lady. Kennedy lore preserves Jackie's reported response when Marilyn called to declare the relationship. "That's great, Marilyn. You'll marry Jack, and you'll move into the White House, and you'll assume all the responsibilities of First Lady. And I'll move out, and you'll have all the problems." Marilyn Monroe was dead by August 5, 1962. Barbiturate overdose, probable suicide. Less than 3 months after that birthday performance. Jackie Kennedy would outlive her by 32 years and spend those decades controlling the story of everyone involved. Jack, Marilyn, Bobby, the era itself. Joe Kennedy Sr.'s apparatus could purchase elections, manage press coverage, and cage a reluctant wife. Friends and aides could supply women for a reckless president, with the Secret Service looking the other way. None of that machinery could alter the trajectory of a rifle round. November 22, 1963. Dallas, Texas. A motorcade designed to maximize visibility for the 1964 re-election Open limousine, slow route, crowds pressing close. Jackie sat inches from JFK in a pink Chanel suit. The shots struck. She climbed onto the trunk of the Lincoln Continental, reaching for a piece of her husband's skull, or instinctively attempting to flee, or reaching for Secret Service agent Clint Hill, sprinting from the follow car. She held JFK's shattered head in her lap during the race to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Hours later, she stood beside Lyndon Johnson on Air Force One as he took the oath of office, still wearing the blood-soaked suit. Aides urged her to change. "I want them to see what they have done to Jack." At the worst moment of her life, her instinct was to control the image. Joe Kennedy Sr. had spent decades managing appearances. His daughter-in-law, in extremis, managed them at a level the patriarch never approached. 7 days separated that limousine from the most consequential act of political myth-making in modern American history. On November 29, 1963, Jackie summoned Theodore H. White to Hyannisport. White was the most respected political journalist in America, author of The Making of the President, 1960, and she had chosen her audience with precision. During the interview, she steered the conversation toward the Lerner and Loewe musical, Camelot, telling White that Jack had loved the record, that it was the last thing playing on the turntable before bed, that the closing lyric held a special meaning for both of them. She quoted the lyrics, "Don't ever let it be forgot that once there was a spot, for one brief shining moment, that was Camelot." She wanted that single word welded to her husband's presidency. Not legislation, not Cuba. An emotion. A lost golden age extinguished by violence. White later acknowledged he felt captured, that he recognized myth-making unfolding in real time, but couldn't resist its emotional gravity. Jackie had secured copy approval before White left Hyannisport. Life's editors pushed back. They felt there was too much Camelot in the piece. Their objections were overruled. The story ran exactly as Jackie wanted it to run. Theodore White later acknowledged that JFK's supposed deep connection to the Camelot legend was untrue, or a misreading of history, that Jackie had inflated or invented the detail entirely. Academic research confirms the Camelot mythology had roots in the Kennedys' self-presentation from the earliest days of JFK's career. But Jackie's single interview with White transformed a branding strategy into a national religion. The article ran in Life, was read by millions, and the word Camelot fused permanently to the Kennedy presidency. One widow, one journalist, one metaphor. 60 years of unbroken control over American memory. Everything the patriarch had built, the media relationships, the purchased elections, the financial arrangements, the scandal management, became raw material in a structure Jackie designed. JFK consistently ranks among the top 3 or 4 presidents in American public polling, despite a truncated tenure scarred by personal scandal. When Americans declare, 6 decades later, that the Kennedys represented something noble and lost, that they were uniquely uncorrupted leaders struck down by dark forces, they are repeating, almost word for word, the emotional framework a 34-year-old widow dictated in 1 week. They exist so deep inside Jackie's construction, they have no idea they're quoting scripture from a text she authored. After Dallas, Jackie shaped the historical record with sustained deliberation. She planned JFK's funeral with a director's precision, the eternal flame at Arlington, the walking procession modeled on Lincoln's, world leaders assembled behind the coffin. In spring 1965, she read an early version of Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s account of the Kennedy administration, actively involving herself in the official narrative while it was still wet on the page. She married Aristotle Onassis years later. The Jackie O backlash was savage. But that marriage secured permanent financial independence from the Kennedy machine, something Joe Sr.'s reported $1 million deal had never provided. She became a book editor at Viking and later Doubleday, building a professional identity entirely her own. Joseph Kennedy Sr. spent his life believing money and media control were the ultimate instruments of American power. He purchased elections, engineered press coverage, built an organization capable of manufacturing outcomes democracy was supposed to determine organically. He was right about nearly everything. The one variable his operational genius missed was that the woman he'd treated as a campaign prop understood narrative at a depth his fortune couldn't reach. She absorbed roughly 200 humiliations, held her husband's shattered skull in her lap on a Dallas street, and 7 days later sat across from a journalist and told a story so powerful that 6 decades haven't weakened a syllable. The Kennedy legacy doesn't belong to the patriarch who purchased it. It belongs to the woman he underestimated, the one who picked up the pen and wrote the ending before anyone in the family realized the story had changed hands. Subscribe for more stories like this.